Welcome and good afternoon. I'm Troy Williams, Southwest Outreach Director for the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Good to join everyone. Would rather be here in person, but so glad we have the opportunity to connect this way. I'm very pleased to be joined by a number of participants from Texas and New Mexico, from for this very important discussion on America's role in the world in the midst of COVID-19. We're honored to have Congresswoman Veronica Escobar with us today to talk about America's critical role in this global fight. She's a vital congressional champion and a rising star in the Democratic Party at this pivotal moment in the pandemic. We'll welcome her to the Zoom in just a minute, but before we do, just to share a bit more about USGLC. Last year, USGLC celebrated 25 years of building a better, safer world. I want to tell you a little bit about what we've been building over the last 25 years. We are over 500 American businesses, humanitarian organizations, alongside our network of business, faith, military, and community leaders from all across the country. Our bipartisan National Advisory Council, chaired by Secretary Colin Powell, is made up of our nation's top national security and foreign policy leaders, including most every living former Secretary of State. Our National Security Advisory Council is comprised of over 200 retired generals and flag officers. Our Veterans for Smart Power initiative is made up of 30,000 veterans from all across the country who are committed to strengthening our non-military tools. And what brings us to all together is a belief that America's role in the world matters to American families and how when America leads, we all win. It's a belief that strategic investments in diplomacy and development are essential to protect our national security, advancing our economic interests, and projecting the best of American values. We talk about why a tiny 1% of the federal budget, called the International Affairs Budget, is one of the most cost effective and powerful investments America can make. It's sometimes called the foreign aid budget, but it's so much more than that. It's our diplomats and embassies around the world, support for our key allies, and programs that create jobs and open new markets, response to humanitarian disasters, and work to battle the root causes of terrorism. Efforts to tackle global health threats like Ebola and COVID-19, which has been a wake-up call that what happens overseas impacts us here right at home. That 1% investment is effective, accountable, and transparent, and it delivers for the American people. We host forums like this with people all over the country, and we see that across the political spectrum, state lines as well, Americans like you want to engage on these issues. COVID-19 continues to underscore the importance of being engaged in the world. And we are so fortunate to be joined by a true expert and change maker who is tackling these challenges in real time to help shape the debate about America's global investments today and into the future to stop the next pandemic or any global crisis in its track. First, I am pleased to welcome our moderator to today's discussion, Michelle Bekkering, Director of National Engagement here at USGLC. Thank you for joining us, Michelle. As well as, of course, I'm pleased to introduce our special guest, who you all know very, very well, Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. She's been hard at work to address the challenges of COVID-19 and keep America safe. Congresswoman Escobar has had a career dedicated to public service, from her work as a county judge in El Paso and her leadership of a nonprofit youth organization to really serve to her service right now in Congress for El Paso and all of her constituents. She sits on the committees of Armed Services, Judiciary, Ethics, and the Special Subcommittee on the climate crisis, and is a strong supporter of America's development and diplomacy programs. Thank you, Congresswoman, for joining us.
It is so my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Great. Well, a big thanks to all of you who have joined us this afternoon. And of course, Congresswoman, I can't think of anyone better to have this discussion with. Someone who has led so ably, both within the state and now representing the state in leadership here in Washington at the federal level. So let's kick this off. Today we're here and we're going to discuss a lot of the pressing global challenges we're facing here in our country. But we're also going to talk about some of the opportunities that we see to address them. And a little bit later in our meeting here, we're going to hear from some of our USGLC's state leaders to weigh in as well with questions. So Congresswoman, I'm going to start the discussion with you and talk about a topic that I feel like we can't really escape these days. Everyone on at this meeting knows that the world has been upended by COVID-19. We see global poverty on the rise. There's authoritarianism, and people increasingly are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. But what we've also increasingly understood is that what's happening globally is affecting us here. It's affecting us locally. We've seen it in our own school systems, our health systems, our own economy. And we really recognize more than ever that there is this linkage between what happens overseas and the health and the safety and the economic interests of us here at home. To that end, we here at USGLC recently launched a new campaign, and it's really to start a conversation around the critical importance of our continued engagement in the world. And we're asking everyone this question: what's it worth? What's foreign aid worth to each of us? What's it worth to America's recovery and future? So Congresswoman, I can't think of anyone better than you to ask this question. And I want to ask it about your citizens in El Paso, in Texas. What are America's investments in diplomacy, in development, and global health worth here at home to you and your citizens?
Well, Michelle, thank you so much. Thank you for moderating. Thanks for your leadership. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm really grateful to the USGLC, not just for this conversation, but for all of the conversations and issues that you all ensure stay top of mind and in the public discourse. And you're right, there is so much to be concerned about across the globe. And we are facing challenges, some of the biggest challenges of our generation, possibly some of the biggest challenges historically. You know, you layer on top of everything that you just described, you know, COVID is enough, but you layer on top of that a climate crisis, you layer on top of that, you know, the situation right now as we talk about race and history and how we bring people together, and a country that finds itself, unfortunately, too often very deeply divided. And you are also right in that what happens outside of our borders is so critical to understanding, and investment that we make outside of our borders is critical to our own security and our own prosperity and safety. And El Paso, Texas, in my view, is a very unique community because we are literally right on the US-Mexico border. We are a binational community, we're an international community. So we are unlike most of America. You know, we're not completely unique because there are border communities all along the southern and northern border that understand our locations as in key corridors for people and goods and everything that helps our economy. But, you know, there's an old saying that I've heard ever since I was a kid in El Paso. Our sister city, literally right across the border, Ciudad Juarez, we are deeply interconnected with Ciudad Juarez. And there's an old saying, if Ciudad Juarez sneezes, El Paso catches a cold, and vice versa. So my community, I think, because of our geography and our location on the US-Mexico border, we are very keenly aware about international relationships. We are also very keenly aware about how what happens to our neighbor is in our self-interest, and ensuring that we have a neighbor that is safe and secure, a neighbor that we collaborate with and work with, that is advantageous to us. And so when I think about investment in stability elsewhere, or investment in security elsewhere, I think constituents like those in El Paso get it. I don't know that all of America gets it. And, you know, and too often we fall into an isolationist perspective where we think, why are we going to spend resources somewhere else when we should be using our resources here at home? But, you know, my dear departed friend, John Lewis, a civil rights advocate, an activist and leader and humanist, used to always remind us, we live in the same house and we have to engage and act that way. We need to realize that we live in the same house, and what happens to other places and other people has a direct impact on us. And circling back to what you mentioned at the top of your question, COVID demonstrated how we truly do live in the same house. And if we can make investments that protect others, we are protecting ourselves. And I'll just add one more thing as I close my response to this question. Yesterday, our community came together, our region really, at one of our ports of entry, the Marcelino Serna port of entry in the lower valley of El Paso. And we came together after lots of incredible collaboration to essentially provide vaccines for 50,000 workers in Ciudad Juarez maquiladoras, so that we could help our neighbor achieve herd immunity. The sooner they achieve herd immunity, the sooner all of us are safer.
No, thank you for that. And I think that illustrates, and your, anecdote about, sneezing and catching the cold, I think really explains, right, very poignantly how there is that interconnectedness. And, I will say here at USGLC, one of the things we've really been advocating for, of course, is, American leadership when it comes to international and equitable vaccine, response. And I think you just kind of outlined why that's important, right? When we talk about, our efforts overseas and why that's important, now that the majority of the US population, we've had that opportunity in recognizing the importance of why we have to invest in this overseas, and why that matters, right? And I think that illustration of how close those communities are really show that when we talk about stopping the spread. Let me do this. I'm curious, and I know that you've had a lot of leadership on this issue. Let's talk about Central America. I want to pivot a little bit. This past year, and I don't have to tell you this, we've seen the Northern Triangle facing increasingly significant challenges. Unfortunately, challenges on top of what they were already experiencing, with not only corruption and governance issues, but we saw 2 devastating hurricanes, and of course, COVID-19, right, which has not spared any region of the world. And because of that, we have seen migration surge. I know that you were with Vice President Harris when she visited El Paso last month, and you explicitly shared how addressing this challenge is going to start with tackling the root causes, right? Why is there migration? What are those drivers? What are those root causes? And so I want to touch on that and ask you to share a little bit more of that with our audience, that perspective. Why is foreign assistance? Why is development such an important part of a solution, especially when this problem is so multifaceted? And want to hear a little bit more too about Congress. How are you within Congress working to ensure that the assistance we are providing to the region is reaching the right targets? And how do we know that it's being effective at combating those drivers of migration?
Oh my gosh, Michelle, that's a great question. Let me start with the tail end.
I apologize. Good question.
No, this is so critical in this particular moment of our American history to talk about. And it's what frustrates me about national media, that we don't do enough about discussing what's happening outside of our borders, so that Americans understand that when we don't act to create stability, especially in our own hemisphere, we will feel the impact, and we shouldn't be surprised when we feel the impact. But to your question is so perfect in terms of what's happening on the border in multiple facets. So how do we ensure that the aid that we are sending to Central America is actually going toward what we intend for it to go toward? How do we ensure that there's accountability, that there's transparency? And to tell you how challenging that task is, but simply because it's challenging doesn't mean we shouldn't do everything possible to create that accountability and create guardrails. But to tell you how challenging that is, let me go back to our first topic, which is COVID, and the way that we're dealing with it on the border, and in our very innovative work to try to create cross-border opportunities for vaccines. So the United States gave the president of Mexico a significant number of vaccines, and our request was that those vaccines go to border communities so that we could, as quickly as possible, reopen our ports of entry. We learned last week that President López Obrador decided not to do that after all, and moved those vaccines to different sites, leaving border communities like ours just throwing our arms up in the air thinking, oh my gosh, the whole purpose of this was to create regional herd immunity. So the same challenge we face the same challenge with Central America. And we know that at the tail end of the Obama administration, the United States government was providing aid to Central America in order to try to create stability, because that's when we started seeing more and more Central American families and frankly, unaccompanied children from Central America arriving at our nation's front door here in El Paso, Texas. And so President Obama and his administration made the attempt to create stability through aid to Central America. That program was still somewhat in its infancy when it was dismantled by the subsequent administration, by the Trump administration. And we now have Vice President Kamala Harris working to try to regain our footing in working collaboratively with Central America to create stability. How do we put guardrails around that? And why should we even do it in the first place? Those are your questions, important questions. So we've got to do it unless we want to keep seeing the same images on our television and on our front pages of our newspapers year in and year out. If we do not address migration and immigration, especially from our own hemisphere, if we don't address it at its root causes, then we will never see an end to people running for their lives. And people are running for their lives for a number of different reasons: for poverty, because they're fleeing poverty, they're fleeing famine, they're fleeing insecurity, persecution. The climate crisis is fueling some of this movement as well. If we do absolutely nothing about any of that, then we shouldn't expect things to change. That is one facet of what we need to do around immigration, but it is a key facet. And that's why I was really so heartened to learn early on in the administration that this would be a priority and that it would rise to the diplomatic level of the vice president's office. So aid is part of that. Money is part of that. That's the bottom line. And we spend trillions of dollars across the globe trying to create stability and trying to ensure that we create neighborhoods that are safe and not a threat to us, because it's in our self-interest. Same thing goes with Central America. But there has been some chronic corruption in Central America, and it is going to be a daunting task. It's going to be difficult and challenging. And that's why we have to assert as much control over the funding as possible. And if we can use as much of that funding through NGOs that possibly are America-based and can use their resources outside of our borders, those are our key collaborators, those are key partners. The last thing we should be doing is writing blank checks or checks to the governments. We also have to make sure that we set out our goals early on and that we follow up on whether we are achieving those goals, that we set up metrics and that we set up accountability, and that there is consistent transparency, that there is vigorous oversight, because we can't afford to not be successful. And it's, from my perspective, it's not because I want to stop migration. I am one of those who believes, I'm not an open borders person, but I believe migration, and I believe the research that demonstrates that immigration offers a net economic positive. And as we're seeing America's census numbers begin to stagnate, as we are reading stories every day about a labor shortage, I think we should lean in on immigration. And I think Congress needs to act. And I am one of those pushing to try to get the votes for the US Citizenship Act. So we've got a role as well. But if we don't do this, Michelle, then we are going to continue to see misery. I mean, people literally running for their lives, willing to risk their lives in order to have hope, in order to have refuge, in order to have an opportunity. That may not appeal to some Americans, but what I hope does appeal to them is that if we create stability elsewhere, then we are able to better manage what happens at our nation's front door.
Well, and you had such a great metaphor the first time around. And what's coming to my mind as you're saying this is, the old adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? And to your point of, when you create that stability, when you address those root causes, right, on the other end, we're not facing with those acute crises of what to do. Let me build on that if I can, because of course at USGLC, we often talk about the nexus between, development, diplomacy, and defense. And, building on what's going on in the Northern Triangle, you sit on the Armed, Services Committee. And I'm really curious, as our participants, I want to hear a little bit more about that. Because the world just seems, wherever you look right now around the world, we are confronted by increasing, protracted and numerous conflicts and crises. And I think of what's been ongoing in Venezuela. We think of the terrible emerging crisis in Ethiopia that we need to be paying attention to, and recognizing that, I think the latest stat is that by 2030, it will be a quarter of the world's population who will live in fragile or conflict affected countries. And I just think that statistic is mind blowing. I think that equates to like 2 billion people. So my question is, what is that nexus? When you sit on a powerful, committee like Armed Services Committee, what do you see as that nexus between the development side, the prevention side, and then let's say the defense side, the cure?
That is also a very timely question. We just had a really great hearing. We've been having our hearings as we on the Armed Services Committee as we're leading up to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, the vast and significant and biggest piece of legislation that we pass every year, a must-pass bill that funds the Department of Defense. And just this morning here in my community on Fort Bliss, one of the most critical assets in terms of our national defense, in terms of our military. I was on Fort Bliss this morning having breakfast with General McConville and with General Sean Bernabe also of Fort Bliss. But General McConville was just before the House Armed Services Committee last week as he and the secretary came before us to testify. And that is, we had in our hearing, we discussed all of the current threats as well as the emerging threats. And we really are in a very fragile moment because we as a country, January 6th, we just recognized yesterday the 6-month date. 6 months ago from yesterday, we had an insurrection, an attack on our democracy, an attack on our country. So we have this internal vulnerability already. You know, we talked a little bit about how our country has been so deeply divided, and there's this terrifying spread of misinformation. So we've got our own challenges at home, but we are also facing these global challenges, and you name it, you named some of them. And all of that translates, you stated it so perfectly, it translates into vulnerable souls who are, you know, at risk, at great risk. And what does that mean? And how do we, in turn, as the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world, what is our responsibility and our obligation? And how do we balance diplomacy and strength, right? At what point do we exercise our strength versus exert all the powers of diplomacy? And I think because I have, one of my brothers is a career foreign service officer, I've heard firsthand about his work and his efforts around diplomacy and the dividends that it pays off to invest in diplomacy, but also invest in development. You know, one other thing that I think is key and critical, and that is working with our friends and allies. And I'm not trying to be political at all, but for 4 years under the prior administration, we did not do that well. And we alienated many friends and allies. And when we are working on building a more stable globe and working to create safety and security for everyone, because it creates safety and security for us, we've got to work with our friends. We've got to work with our allies. We cannot go it alone. We've seen historically, both in recent history and in the distant past, that going it alone is the hardest, most unsuccessful way to approach these big challenges. But working with our friends does also mean keeping our friends and allies accountable, making sure that they are at the table with us as we make investments. And I'll give you an example close to home. I think in the Western Hemisphere, as we are thinking through the challenges that we are seeing with what is essentially mass migration emerging from Central America coming northward, we need to work with all of our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere, and that includes Canada. And we all need to be at the table with solutions and investments to ensure that we create stability in our quote unquote neighborhood, in our hemisphere. And I think that's where those friendships and those alliances really pay off. You know, we've seen the administration working very closely with Mexico and working through and thinking through addressing the short-term challenges as well as the long-term challenges. We need to reach further north and really come together in a way that where we can leverage our resources, leverage our brain power, leverage our efforts so that we can be most successful.
Well, and I think there's such, an important messaging point there too, right? Especially to those in the States who have often said, why does it seem like, we're doing this alone? Or, I have thought often, I've been in international development for a long time, where people say, why is it just up to the American taxpayers? And I've often said, listen, there's no one more generous and gracious than the American people. But to your point, I think we've all increasingly seen that there will never be enough funding in the world. There will never be one country able to address all these crises, all these challenges we see. But increasingly, when we can work together with other countries, our bilateral partners, our multilateral partners, it helps us, to your point, one, collaborate and find where we're each best suited, to contribute to those efforts. And it also helps with that, to combine resources and talent, but specifically financially. Let me do this. Let me stop here. I have a list of questions I could ask you, but it would be a bit selfish. And we are joined here today by our fabulous members of our state advisory committee. And I'm going to ask right now, I'm going to turn the floor to someone I think you know well, John Barella with Borderplex Alliance. John, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And thank you very much to the USGLC for the mission that you all accomplish every single day. Your goals and objectives are certainly needed now more than ever in this world that can be so very unpredictable. And Michelle, thank you so much for your gracious moderation of this discussion. And of course, to Congresswoman Escobar, we're very, very fortunate here in El Paso to have you representing this congressional district in Washington. And we appreciate all the hard work and service you provide to everybody here in this county. Congresswoman, I have a couple of questions, but first let me explain to those who are on this video conference that the Borderplex Alliance, to my knowledge, is the only privately funded organization that does economic development work and policy advocacy in 3 states and 2 countries. We represent Ciudad Juarez, El Paso County, and my home county of Doña Ana County, New Mexico. We are in fact one integrated region. Historically, culturally, and economically. Certainly the pandemic took its toll over the past year or so. Our trade, cross-border trade and our ports dropped to $29 billion in 2020 compared to $76 billion the year before. So clearly that had an impact on retail trade in particular here in our region. So Congresswoman, 2 questions for you, and thank you for your leadership once again on these issues. But in your opinion, how can American assistance programs help small businesses and any business recover from the economic impacts of the COVID crisis, specifically by helping these businesses with various aid programs coming from the federal government? And I think the second question, you more or less indirectly answered already in your introductory comments. And the second half is, how do our efforts here in the United States to create more prosperous societies overseas ultimately support our own jobs and economic development efforts here in the U.S.?
John, it's great to see you. And let me just take a moment to thank you for your leadership and your work, your advocacy. The voice of your organization and your voice in particular has been really important, not just through the pandemic, but especially now as our ports are still closed, our land ports. And that closure and the ongoing inability of folks to move back and forth freely in the way that we have always enjoyed, it doesn't just impact families, it doesn't just impact our 2 communities, in terms of our relationships, it impacts our economy. And so your voice has been really important and key in reminding Congress and reminding the Department of Homeland Security, reminding the White House that we need to get these ports reopened. And so I absolutely stand with you, and I'm so proud of your advocacy on behalf of our region. And you're right, we've got to make sure that we are opening up new markets that will translate into new opportunities, new revenue, and an expanded economy for our incredible businesses here in the Borderplex. My priority coming out of this painful year and a half and this pandemic, really the first step for me is making sure that all of these businesses are made whole, and that we do our best to help them get back on their feet after the losses that they have suffered during the pandemic. So I'm a co-sponsor of a bill, the Border Business COVID-19 Rescue Act, that is specific to border businesses. It would establish a loan program through the SBA in order to specifically help border businesses. And so, I'm hoping to get as much aid to our small businesses and our border businesses as possible. But I think the other component is looking for new avenues for our small manufacturers here. And I've been working to try to connect the Department of Defense and other defense-related industries with our university, which has incredible talent, young people, their brilliance, their innovation, trying to connect them so that we create another leg for our economic development table and only get stronger. And hopefully that will open up new avenues. But I also think as we begin to think about what Michelle and I were talking about, which are the emerging threats elsewhere, and as we think about threats, for example, threats coming from China, that we try to reshore and bring back some of what we have lost, and that we use that to our advantage. We have such an incredible location. We have a diverse workforce. We have engaged leaders like yourself. And so we've got it all. So we've got to get back on our feet, number one. But number two, we've also we have to recognize those threats that exist and recognize that it's in our best interest to bring opportunity closer to home.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Great seeing you as well. Thanks again for all your hard work. We appreciate you very, very much.
Thank you, John.
Great, thanks, John. And now I'm excited. We're going to turn the floor over to our friend Robin Lerner, and Robin is with the Texas International Education Consortium. So Robin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you so much, Congresswoman Escobar. It's really wonderful to be on this program with you. So quickly, the Texas International Education Consortium, TIC for short, we're based out of Austin, but we represent originally the public universities of Texas, including UTEP, UT Rio Grande Valley, a lot of the border, honestly, across the state. We've actually expanded our consortium to also include private universities like Rice, Baylor, SMU, and hopefully, and more and growing. So we really kind of represent, we have a membership that spans the entire state, and our goal is to increase international partnerships and programs and to help spur new partnerships for our Texas universities with universities around the world, and actually take Texas ingenuity and apply it toward doing good in the world through US programs, development, capacity building. We do a lot of capacity building with higher education around the world because, like you said, we have it all here in Texas, and there's no program we can't do with Texas ingenuity. We just have to get those programs and link people up. So one of the big things that we've been very keyed into this year is international students. So as you probably know, last year was really hard on our universities. International students had to leave. Some of them were allowed to stay. There were lots of issues. We're very pleased to see DHS allow students that were already in country to continue even fully virtual. And we appreciate the sort of like flexibility that we've continued to be able to have from the DHS Student Exchange Visitor Program. But looking at this summer, starting back in the spring, we could see that consulates were not open. They weren't processing visas, and the number of international students is going to be once again low. It has always been a priority for each administration to see a vigorous amount of international students coming in and scholars, but also, of course, seeing our students go around the world as well. You may or may not know, but estimates show that international students and scholars contribute about $2 billion to just the Texas economy and tens of thousands of jobs. And that's just counting the academics. We have so many international visitors coming into the state. I'm sure you know that. And we want to keep that going, of course, in a safe and healthy way, of course. My feeling is that our universities have shown that they've been able to do that and manage that themselves quite well. So I guess I'd love to hear from you what you think Congress can do to help kind of open up, get some of these international visitors back here, what you think the prognosis is, and do you even think that this is an important thing for Congress to confront?
Robin, thanks for your work and for all that you do to keep innovation and collaboration alive and functioning, and especially over the last year and a half thriving. So thank you for all of that. Congress absolutely has a role. And I will tell you, I have been very concerned, not just about the fact that we we're not moving as quickly as we need to on those visas. We're not investing in the personnel needed to really get all of that moving. And my hope is that all of that will change, that with this new budget, and as we, you know, I mean, who knows what's going to happen at this point. Like we're probably going to have a continuing resolution, but we do have an administration that is looking to open up those pathways that are so critical. And again, it goes to what Michelle and I were talking about, which is it is advantageous for us to capitalize on this. We grow, our economy grows, and having an isolationist perspective where we don't want to bring people in, where we don't want to be inclusive or collaborative, that's destructive. It makes us less competitive. It shrinks our opportunities. It shrinks our world, literally. It shrinks our world. And so, you know, again, not to get political, and I'm not trying to get political here at all, but the politics of the day have been, I think, destructive, and they've moved us further and further away from seeing the opportunities in front of our face. And those, I mentioned briefly earlier, our stagnant population growth, the need for more innovation, the fact that we are in global competition. You know, I'll refer back to some of my other hearings on the Armed Services Committee. And as we're talking about global competitiveness and we're talking about threats to our country, what the experts keep telling Congress over and over and over again is invest in yourselves, invest in innovation, invest in talent. And investing in talent means luring talent and collaborating with talent and exposing our own students, exposing our own educational centers to the brilliance from abroad. And so, and we can do it safely and securely. We obviously have to always keep that in mind. And, you know, today's collaborator could be tomorrow's threat. And we know that, and we recognize that. But there are ways to do this, and we build our institutions in a way that creates more security from that perspective. But we have everything to gain by pursuing these kinds of collaborations and this kind of welcoming, and we have everything to lose if we don't. And so when we're thinking about threats, when we're thinking about competition, you know, we've got to think about being a far more inclusive, thoughtful society, one that sees the opportunities that abound when we open up educational collaborations and pipelines and innovation to others. And so Congress can create more legal pathways to do that. Congress can and should invest in the agencies that funnel those pathways. For the last few years, though, we've seen a lot of public servants leaving these institutions, and many of our institutions right now are in the process of rebuilding many of our agencies. But I think it's very important that we do everything we can as Congress to accelerate that. You know, we should want the best and the brightest, and we should create those legal pathways to ensure that we have them.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I think, you know, a lot of what you said is how we feel too, that, you know, some of these programs are actually self-sustaining once we actually can get the visas back in process. You know, the students pay for them, it pays for the personnel, it pays for the monitoring and evaluation of those programs. So if you ever need any talking points or any backup evidence as for how much these having an international diverse campus does for our Texas students, we're happy to help provide that.
And, you know, I'll say one more thing, Robin, just in closing, because we are absolutely completely aligned on this. One of the things I'm so proud of in my binational international community, you mentioned UTEP, the University of Texas at El Paso. It has a program specific to cross-border students because we have for years understood the vibrancy it creates. I'm a graduate of UTEP. I got my undergraduate degree there. And I loved walking through campus and hearing Spanish everywhere. It's made me a better Spanish speaker. It creates an air of internationalism. We're able to capitalize on growth, and it's part of what makes it, in my view, our binational community so rich and so beautiful. And it's why I think we are so open to welcoming the stranger in so many ways, because that's who we are, and that's our location. And UTEP really for many, many, many years has paved the way in rethinking how we think about in-state tuition and how we welcome folks, because again, it's in our best interest. It's advantageous to us. So I would love to collaborate with you and work with you.
And we now, Robin, have it on record and video that you have offered to write talking points. Congresswoman, thank you so much. Today we covered such honestly heavy topics. But I'm coming out of this with a sense of optimism. I just want to thank you for your bright spirit. And what I'm hearing from you, and I think the rest of our community has heard from you, we can address these issues. There's hope. We just have to, collaborate, cooperate, work with our partners. And the American spirit is, it will always prevail. So thank you for your optimism. Thank you for your leadership. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor back over to our friend Troy to close today's event.
Thank you. And thank you, Congresswoman Escobar, for this engaging conversation during this pivotal moment for our country. Thank you for your leadership and all of your support. It's so greatly appreciated. Thank you to our Texas and New Mexico Advisory Committee members, our veterans for Smart Power who joined us, as well as the El Paso Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Texas International Education Consortium, and the Borderplex Alliance for all of your help putting this event together. We're so appreciative that you all joined us for this conversation, to really thank Representative Escobar for all of her work and support of America's global leadership. Thanking your congressperson and sharing your position is critical to keeping America's leadership around the globe strong. So we protect our economic interests, our national security, and humanitarian values. Your voice matters and certainly makes all the difference. For up-to-the-minute updates, please follow us on Twitter, join our mailing list, join our upcoming events. But we look forward to meeting with you again and hope that you all stay safe, and look forward to continuing this conversation with each of you moving forward. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to connecting in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Troy. Thanks, everyone.